Now? Okay. Okay, we're going to get started with the first talk. So I'd like to just quickly introduce Matt Spisak, who's going to be talking about hardware-assisted rootkits and debugging reversing on ARM. Cool.
All right, thanks. So this is the first time I've been able to present research publicly, so I'm excited to be here, but also a little bit nervous standing up in front of all of you, so bear with me. So I work at Endgame. I work on a team focused on vulnerability research and prevention. We do some vulnerability discovery, but more recently we've been focused on exploit mitigation research. and I've been doing mobile and embedded research since the Nokia N series was kind of the most popular smartphone before the original iPhone. So our outline today, I had to scratch trust zone. This is like 3 talks in one, so I'm gonna have to talk fast here. But if there's interest, I can either blog about the trust zone part, or if you have questions, I'll be here throughout the conference. So to start, to kind of set the stage for the original motivation, or part of the motivation, is I kind of get frustrated with the tools and approaches available for debugging embedded systems. In particular, I like working with basebands, and there's really no good universal solution. With hardware, JTAG is ideal. The problem is to get kind of widespread support on multiple devices is not realistic on COTS equipment. Software, on the other hand, is kind of portable and scalable, but most of the tools you find for like Android and iOS, they're kind of limited to user mode. And then emulation's really cool, but the problem is, I'm always interested in the low-level interface. Maybe the interaction with the modem or other drivers, and so trying to spend time to emulate that is just too costly. So my personal philosophy has always been to make use of real hardware. Everything I want is in this phone right here, so why not make use of it? And I like software-based tools just because it's more portable. So we're going to step through the ARM debug architecture, kind of in search of something else. So the debug architecture, there's basically invasive debugging and non-invasive. And invasive debugging, you can do things like halt the CPU. Really the takeaway from this slide should be that there's a couple authentication signals, the debug enable and the SPIDEN for secure world. And if neither of those are asserted high, then the only debug event supported is the software breakpoint instruction. So our options are kind of limited on COTS devices because of that. On the flip side, non-invasive debugging includes features like trace. You might be familiar with like embedded trace macrocell or program trace. That's not the subject of this talk, although it would make for an interesting subject. And it's interesting because trace can be controlled from software, but I think it'll be, it might be hit and miss whether, which devices, which chipsets do support that, but it is worthwhile mentioning that trace is something to explore further. Another non-invasive feature that we don't really care about right now is sample-based profiling. There's registers you can query periodically to get the state of the program counter. But the focus of this talk is on the PMU. And I know that the PMU might be a bit of an overloaded term in embedded systems, so we're not talking about the power management, we're talking about the performance monitoring unit. Or you may have heard of hardware performance counters. So that's the subject of today's discussion. So the PMU is an optional extension in ARM, but ARM recommends it. And most importantly, it has a mandatory software interface via the system control coprocessor, so CP15. It was introduced in ARM v6, so you can find it in ARM 11 cores, Cortex-R, Cortex-A. The only family you won't find it in is Cortex-M, and you'll find it in custom cores as well. And the premise behind the PMU is that you've got one or more counters, a set of events that can be counted, and then the PMU can fire an interrupt when a counter overflows. And so that kind of gives you the ability to do kind of sampling. So if I wanted to instrument every time an event occurred 10 times, I could initialize a counter to say -10. And it provides feedback. What's it there for? It allows you to kind of inspect the CPU and see how it's performing. It could be useful for software or hardware purposes. And there are tools out there, commercial and open source. ARM Development Studio 5 Streamline's really cool. This is a screenshot from it. You should check it out. There's a trial version. And Linux Perf No Profile are obviously in the Linux kernel, and they support more than ARM, x86 and other architectures as well. So before kind of stepping forward, a few quick abbreviations. You'll see PMU, PMI, and PMC throughout this talk. And I realize some of you may not be as familiar with the ARM architecture, so I threw the exception vector table in there. These are the various exception vectors. The one to, I guess, maybe if you only remember one, just remember the supervisor call, which most OSs use to service system calls. And then as far as privilege modes, you're going to see like PLO and PL1 throughout the talk. And so if maybe you're only familiar with the ring terminology, those are sort of the corresponding modes. So PMU assisted research has been done before. One of the more interesting papers was this using hardware performance events to do instruction level monitoring. So basically they trap every single instruction or branch to a hypervisor, but on x86. We've seen some cool ROP detection work using the PMU by various researchers using mispredicted return branches. And we've seen rootkit detection using performance counters, control flow integrity. You can come check out our team at Black Hat this year. We're going to be talking about control flow integrity using the PMU on the Intel architecture. And really that's the real motivation behind this talk is, we've been doing this research on Intel. I'm kind of a mobile security guy at heart, so I was curious on the portability to ARM, and this is kind of where it ended up. But as you notice, all this related work is focused on the Intel architecture, so there's plenty of room for exploration on ARM. So a few sample events that we can count. This is similar to what you'll find on other architectures: instructions, branches, cache access, cache miss, etc. And I'm going to breeze through the registers that we can access through that system control coprocessor. So the control register tells us how many counters exist on the PMU, and it's sort of the least significant bit there is sort of like a global enable, so it's like turning the PMU on and off. There's registers for enabling. Once you turn on the PMU, you have to enable a specific counter, so you would write the appropriate bit offset to turn on the various counters or turn them off. And then finally, there's a counter selection register, which you have to tell the PMU, from this point on, I'm going to be referring to this counter. And then once you do that, you can set the events that you want to count or the query or set the actual counter value. And so notice in the event filter register, there's only 8 bits that ARM has for events, so they're kind of limited there. But the most significant bits are used for mode inclusions. So on the right, there's a little table that shows you, like, if we wanted to count branches, we could do so in user mode, kernel mode, hypervisor mode. We can do those all by default because they're all in normal world. It gets a little bit more tricky with the secure world because we need a secure non-invasive debug signal to be asserted. And there are COTS devices with that enabled, but finally, the event counter register I mentioned, that's the actual count, and you can read and write that. So as far as configuring counters, first we would, this basically turns on the PMU, so we're setting that least significant bit of the control register. Next, we're setting the first counter, so we're selecting counter 1, and then we're writing an 8 to the event type, which is instructions executed. So we're configuring the counter to count instructions. Next, we initialize the counter to -3. Maybe we want to sample every 3 events. And then finally, we enable counter 1 by writing to the counter enable bit. So the other half of the PMU is interrupts. So there's separate registers in ARM for enabling or disabling interrupts for a given counter. And so if we want to enable both counters 1 and 2, we write the value 3 to the interrupt enable register. And then if we, on an interrupt, we have to query the overflow status register and clear it. So how do you know if a given PMU can count? We have to query, you can start by querying the debug auth status register, which is in the debug coprocessor, CP14. And that will tell you whether invasive or non-invasive debug is supported. And then if once you realize non-invasive debug is supported, then you can query the debug feature register to get the specific version of the PMU that this particular chip supports. And there's ARMv8 introduced PMU version 3. So here's kind of a sampling of various chipsets. I tried to get a device with kind of each chipset manufacturers. So the main device I worked with was a Nexus 6, but just to kind of show you, all these Qualcomm, MediaTek, Samsung, Huawei, HiSilicon chips all have non-invasive debug supported, and they all have PMU version 2. And of note at the bottom there, I included the Broadcom chip from my Nexus. It also has a PMU and is capable of counting. So obviously the Huawei device looks like it's ready to be debugged because it looks like anything goes. But hopefully this is just kind of a reflection that the PMU is quite common in COTS devices. So our first case study is going to be using the PMU to do some instrumentation, specifically tracing. So our approach, much like the paper I referenced, is that we want to cause frequent PMU overflows in order to interrupt and trap instructions or branches. And so CoreSite's program flow trace it captures basically branches, or it calls them waypoints. And we can come pretty close to the same functionality using the PMU. So we want to count all branches, both predicted and mispredicted. We're going to set our counters to -1, and we'll use our ISR, our interrupt service routine, to do the instrumentation. So to kind of visualize, step through this, we initialize our counter to -1, and we're counting branches here. So a branch is about to occur, counter overflows, PMU triggers an interrupt. Our ISR can then capture the saved program counter, capture registers, capture memory, whatever you want to do. Then we reset the counter to -1. Code continues to exit. None of these are branches, so the counter is not incrementing. Here we come to another branch. Branch occurs, counter overflows. Our ISR can then do our introspection or instrumentation, and then we reset the counter, and it continues. So some of you that are familiar with Linux perf might ask, well, what about Linux perf? So I decided to kind of do all this from scratch for a few reasons. The first, I wanted to write my own custom ISR, even if perf had a callback for being invoked within the ISR. And long-term vision was more towards baseband, so I didn't really want to be like married to Linux. And finally, getting my hands dirty was important in order to learn, how the PMU works on ARM. So that said, the perf source is a really handy resource for the PMU, not just on ARM, but on the other architectures as well. So I should probably mention I've got 2 kids at home, and much of this research kind of started out after hours, and it's as you can imagine, it's hard to find time to do research with kids, so it was always small windows, whether I was putting them to bed or while they're watching cartoons. So I feel like the graphics in this slide deck kind of accurately reflect my state of mind while doing this research. So the first challenge we have is we need to figure out how to register for interrupts. So the ARM generic interrupt controller spec kind of outlines both private peripheral and shared peripheral interrupts, and the interrupt IDs. So basically in like Linux, for example, we need to register for interrupt, but we need to know the IRQ number that the PMU is going to use. And this spec recommends using interrupt ID 23, but not every chipset has to use the generic interrupt controller. There's custom. So the first place we can look is device tree source. Those are the .dts and .dtsi files you might find in like an Android source. And basically those files kind of outline specs and configurations of the hardware. And sometimes you'll find the PMU in there. And so this is from the Nexus 6. We see this interrupts tuple. So the first value is the type, well, tells us whether it's a shared or private peripheral interrupt. In this case, it's private. And the interrupt number is like the offset. So from our last slide, we know that the private interrupts start at offset 16. So we can do the math and come up with 23, which matches ARM spec. The problem is not every device uses the PMU, even though it's there. And so you're not always going to find something like this in the device tree source. So for that, I went for the brute force approach. So like on the Amazon tablet or with the MediaTek chipset, I basically
read proc interrupts, found every unused shared and private peripheral interrupt, registered for those, then basically configured the PMU to overflow a specific number of times, and then went back to proc interrupts to see which interrupt number corresponded to X number of IRQs. And so that works, but it's kind of not as straightforward as looking in some source. And as far as implementation, I mentioned there's a couple handy APIs in Linux, and if we think about embedded firmware, ultimately we need to patch the IRQ vector handler, probably at the end before returning to the mode it came from. So the second big problem is something called interrupt shadow. So let's say our counter overflows on this branch, but the interrupt doesn't occur, and then another branch occurs, counter increments to a +1, and then eventually we get an interrupt. So these highlighted instructions kind of represent this interrupt shadow, and so we've had a skid of 4 instructions before the PMU fired the interrupt. And because of this, we can potentially lose up to 15%. That's a kind of rough metric of trace data, but we'll see in a minute how we can kind of overcome that. So I put together a prototype for Android. There's 3 components. There's a kernel module, user space daemon, and then an IDA plugin. And basically the kernel module just configures the PMU on each core, registers for interrupts on that core. And then as branches occur, the interrupt service routine just captures the saved program counter at the time of interrupt, and it buffers it so it's not like sending small amounts of data. And I use the Linux relay file system to kind of pipe that to user space, and then that gets sent over to IDA. And so then we can use IDA for visualizing our coverage, as well as controlling the daemon in terms of which threads we want it to monitor, starting and stopping, and some other features I'll show here in a minute. So basically, this picture kind of represents an ideal case where we're counting branches. So we might get a saved program counter from the branch to sysread, from the branch from fgetLite, from the branch returning from VFS read, and the branch returning from fput. So then we just need to connect the dots. So kind of we can use IDA to our advantage because it's done all the hard work of the control flow of each function. So we can basically say, if we have a trace point in the block, a basic block, we know that block is being executed, so we can count and color that one. And if there's only one cross-reference to the block or from the block, we can go ahead and count and color those as well, since we know that execution's going that way. So that helps us with this problem. So I mentioned interrupt shadow. So let's say that the return from VFS read continued executing, and we didn't trigger the interrupt until this move instruction. So here now we've got a block that doesn't have a trace point in it, but our earlier algorithm kind of helps cover that. Plus, if you're using this for fuzzing or code coverage, you don't really care because you're going to be hitting these code paths so many times that eventually an interrupt's going to occur inside of that basic block. We could probably make this more precise by using a second counter to count number of instructions between interrupts and then properly fill in the gaps, but this seemed effective enough. So first demo here, basically, and I have all recorded demos just because there's too many moving pieces, but the requirements here that the device has to be rooted. Obviously, the kernel might need to be recompiled to support loadable kernel modules. I use the config preempt notifiers to turn the PMU on and off based on the thread I'm interested in tracing. So config preempt, although I haven't seen many kernels that don't have that enabled by default. And finally, I trimmed out a slide, but one of the big challenges with tracing kernel mode is the idea that if we were to reset our counter to -1 within our interrupt service routine, as soon as it returned out of the ISR, that would cause an overflow and we'd find ourselves in an interrupt loop. So the way I got around it was I added like 4 instructions to the end of the IRQ vector handler before it returns to supervisor mode, and I reset the counter there to -2. That way, the return from the IRQ vector handler increments it to -1, and then the next branch we encounter is the one that we want to trap. So that could potentially require recompiling the kernel, but I think you could do the same, just hot patching the kernel from the kernel module. So our first demo here, I'll do two demos of this tool. So the first we're going to trace kernel mode, and then on the Nexus 6, and then the second we'll do something in user mode. So basically we're gonna load our plugin, and the device is already attached. So we're gonna attach, and here we can choose whether we want to trace user mode, kernel mode, and we can see all the running processes or kernel threads to attach to. So for this demo, I'm going to attach to the WL event handler, which is a Wi-Fi kernel thread. And I've got the eScan handler loaded here. And so now I started the trace, and I'm basically I just turned on the Wi-Fi, and we start to see blocks getting colored in. And the window in the upper left basically shows us all the functions that have been hit and the number of unique trace points we've gotten from those functions. So we can click around. And notice there's like a little code coverage, so it's basically telling us what percentage at the basic block level and instruction level from that instruction. So this is the second demo. Now we're doing user mode. So I'm going to pause it a sec, so we're doing pretty well on time. So this time I have a library loaded that's dealing with QMI, which is some of the communications coming back from the modem. So we're going to attach to RealD on the device, and so basically we're going to start a trace, and with the attached phone, I'm going to make a phone call. And there's so much data coming back right now that the trace functions window can't keep up, but I'm calling good old Columbus time and weather. And the function I think that's loaded here is something to, QMI voice all call status indicator. So we can see, which instructions have been hit. So now we can pause the trace so that this window can catch up. And so these are all the functions that have been hit. If we scroll down, we see a lot of QMI voice related things. But where I kind of see this being powerful is in with embedded systems is doing like differential debugging. So here we're going to do sort of a differential debug. So we'll tell the plugin, remember everything we've seen, but go ahead and clear out the trace function history. And then now we'll resume the trace and send ourselves a text message because maybe we want to like isolate SMS handling. So I'll send myself a text, and we see a text comes up that says, trace this, please. And if we look at our traced functions, those that have symbols, we can see, most of them are QMI SMS. And so maybe we see this SMS command callback function. Maybe we're interested in this one, interested in looking at it further. So just to kind of show you, you can do more than just capturing program counter. Maybe we can say, hey, capture registers every time a trace point happens in this function. So now I'll send myself another text message, and we should see every new trace point highlighted where we can click on it and get register snapshot or a stack dump at that point in time. We can step through our code here, and everywhere we see this one of these red trace points, we can click on to view trace, which obviously could be useful for some dynamic analysis. So you might ask yourself, so big deal, Android instrumentation. But I guess the way to think about it is more the approach. So we're using the PMU to do this, and in theory we can apply this to other chips. In fact, I got as far with the Broadcom Wi-Fi where I had patched the interrupt service routine, and I could cause it to count branches. Where I kind of got held up was on identifying the interrupt number, but this is kind of less invasive than software breakpoint instruction tracing. We can easily support user or kernel mode, and again, we're not limited to branch tracing. You could put whatever instrumentation logic you want in your interrupt service routine. And finally, basebands, whether Wi-Fi or cellular, also have these PMUs. So Intel, MediaTek, potentially other ARM-based cellular basebands also have PMUs. Apple's chips found in iPhones and iPads have a PMU, and we're also not limited to ARM here. PowerPC and MIPS and other architectures have similar performance monitoring units. So this is kind of where the research took a 180, because originally I was thinking, oh, I'm going to extend this to some sort of baseband, but I got majorly distracted. So quick prior art in ARM-based rootkits. I think the most traditional ARM kernel rootkit would be to either patch the syscall table or patch the exception vector table. We've also seen hot patching of kernel functions. We've seen trust zone-based rootkits. We've seen moving the exception vector table by toggling a bit in a control register. So there's been some interesting research in ARM-based rootkits. So the inspiration for me came while reading the manual. So ARM basically has there's like a set of maybe 30 or so events that are like considered architectural, and a subset of those are mandatory. But then, because there's sort of flexibility for vendors to sort of extend the PMU, they have this table that lists sort of recommended event encodings and what they are. And so if you notice here, for these suggested events, this basically looks like the exception vector table. So, and coupled with the fact we were just sort of aggressively trapping branch instructions by configuring a counter to be -1, in theory, couldn't we just trap any of these exceptions? Now, I will mention that ARM does have a count all exceptions, and you could try to use that. The problem is that since the PMU interrupt is delivered via IRQ, and IRQs are included in the all exceptions, you'll run into this big mess of, a legit IRQ occurs, which triggers a PMU IRQ, which then you might find yourself in a messy interrupt loop. So this, however, is perfect because we can pick, for example, supervisor calls or something, and focus on those. So this is kind of where I was like, what do we do next? Because this is kind of, we could go offense, we could go defense, we could look closer at trust zone. So rather than doing a lot of one thing, I kind of ended up doing a bunch of things. So that's kind of why this talk is like, could be, separated into individual talks. But a quick note on ARM licenses. So there's basically a core license, which is like you use ARM's core design, and then there's the architectural license, which allows you to build a custom design as long as you implement the ARM instruction set. And so Qualcomm, Apple, there's lots of vendors have architectural licenses. But I mentioned that because I wanted to show which cores are capable of counting the exception vector table. And so the Cortex A7, A53, A57, A72, those are all ARM's design. And I wanted to just show that, not only is it in the manual as a suggested event, it's included by default on the newest 64-bit cores, A57, A72. And then on the right, I did most of my research on this Nexus 6 device, which is the crate architecture, but I wanted to show that, custom-based ARM designs, these three are by Qualcomm also count, but, I just want to make the distinction that that's not obviously unique to their custom design. This stems from the ARM manual and is included by default on some of ARM's cores. So if we look at the manual, we'll see earlier I kind of ran through the C12 through C14 control registers, and those are the ARM performance monitoring extensions. But ARM in their manual states, that those that want to extend the PMU, and it makes sense to want to extend it because vendors might add custom features, might be custom designs. They reserved C15 for what they call implementation defined monitors. And Qualcomm uses this. I looked at an older, I think an Apple A6 chip, and it also uses this for their kperf kernel profiling. And there's probably others that extend this as well. So quick bit about Qualcomm's architecture. So basically their custom cores have been through like 3 iterations, so Scorpion, Crate, and Cryo. Whatever point in time, generally you'll find them in kind of the highest end smartphones. So like, right now you can find the Cryo in HTC 10 and some of the other devices that just came out. And I'm going to be focusing on the Crate architecture, but the same definitely applies to Scorpion. And I haven't had time to play with Cryo, but just from looking at source, it seems like it kind of follows the same methodology. So what they've done is extended the PMU, and they've added 4 event select registers, 1 for their vector floating point unit and 3 for various other parts of the CPU. And the crate events get encoded based on a combination of a code, a group, and then the region of the CPU. And in order to use these extra event select registers, after programming them, you have to basically, I kind of like to think of it as setting up a link. So the ARM-based event select register, you kind of have to point to the appropriate crate region and group. So in this table at the bottom, we see 3 different regions, how we can read and write to them. That you can find some documentation on event codes from some really old Scorpion source, but to come up with these event code numbers, I had to do a little bit of black box analysis. So basically, I sort of walked every possible event code until I saw like a wrap or like a duplication of events, which signifies that I've run out of bits. And it seems like there's a lot of events, and only some of them are documented. I'd love to see the full list because I think there's some potentially powerful stuff you could do on ARM. But and then finally, we see the bottom line there. That's sort of like that's what I call the link. So we're setting the ARM event select register to some base value that's ORed with the group, and it's kind of like telling the PMU to like look over here for the event code. So for example, if we wanted to count prefetch aborts with a combination in the crate architecture, that particular event code happens to be B, and it's group 3, region 0. So in order to configure our PMU to count prefetch aborts, we have to shift the B over by 3 bytes, and then we write that to the crate region 0 event select register. And then we go back to the ARM event select register and we point it at crate region 0 by coming up with this value CF, which is, and you can actually look at the source in Android and see how this is encoded, both in their Scorpion and crate PMU source. And basically, yeah, it's allows you to extend the PMU and count sort of custom events. So the idea behind a PMU assisted rootkit is then the fact that, hey, let's count supervisor calls, since most OSs use that vector for handling system calls. Let's try to trap all these supervisor call instructions, and then our ISR routine becomes the rootkit. So we get code execution at some point after the supervisor call instruction, and then we can redirect code execution by modifying the saved registers however we want. And so one of the advantages of this is it kind of avoids the current state in terms of patch protection or kernel integrity measuring. Now, I didn't test this against in the mobile space. I'm only aware of Samsung has I think it's called TIMA. It's like a kernel integrity monitor, but it runs in TrustZone, and then Apple has their kernel patch protection. And I would guess that neither of those would care about this, because you're just registering for an interrupt service routine, and you're not touching the kernel image. And so the installation of the rootkit is basically you configure the PMU, which is a few MRC, MCR instructions, followed by registering for interrupts. Now, there are some challenges to the implementation. So first off, as soon as the SVC instruction goes to the exception vector handler, interrupts are immediately disabled, and then they're re-enabled later. And so even if the PMU is ready to fire an interrupt, because the most interrupt controllers are configured to deliver the PMU with normal IRQ priority, we wouldn't get code execution until after this CPSIE instruction in this particular Android source. So we have 3 cases we have to deal with because of the instruction skid I mentioned before. So even though interrupts are enabled right here, the PMU's interrupt might be handled somewhere in the vector SWI handler before branching to the resolved system call routine. We could be interrupted right at the entry point of the system call routine, or we could be interrupted after. And so our malicious ISR has to deal with all 3 of these. So the first case, and I should mention, I kind of put the stats on the frequency that I saw from each of these. So by far, the most common case is the green section, but we do have to account for those others if we want to make sure we can always redirect. So basically, we can retrieve the saved supervisor mode and user mode registers in our ISR, and then we use register 7, to filter. Maybe we're looking for sys read, or we're looking to hook read, for example, in this example. And then from that point, once we identify that we are in the green case here, we basically need to see how far we've been interrupted past that CPSIE instruction. So we compute an offset, and then we can emulate the remaining instructions. But we can ignore every instruction that's dealing with resolving the syscall routine's address from the syscall table lookup, because we're going to be taking care of that. but we just apply whatever, apply whatever this code's doing towards the saved registers, and then at the end, we can set the link register and set the program counter to our hook. So that's sort of an easier case. So this case is even easier. So this is where the interrupt occurred, and you happen to be right at the entry point of the syscall routine that we want to hook. So in this case, we can just look up and see that, hey, the program counter matches the address of the legitimate sysread function, and then we swap the program counter with the address of our hook. So then the final case, which is the most challenging, is we're some point in the middle of sysread, or past the entry point. So how do we deal with this? So I chose to implement it by allowing the syscall routine to complete and then hooking it after it was done. So I did that by we see up here that retfast syscall is being pushed onto the stack. So I grab the save stack pointer and I walk backwards until I find retfast syscall, and then I replace that with a trampoline address. And our trampoline address can fix up the link register and then branch to what I call a post hook function. And so then our post hook function can then query the saved user mode registers in order to get the original parameters passed into the syscall routine. And then we can copy buffers back to the kernel and modify them as necessary. So the limitation of this approach is this kind of assumes we only care about hooking data that's coming from the kernel to user mode. If, for example, we wanted to hook like write or send or something, we would have to come up with another approach, because we can't just let syswrite complete, because the damage would be done at that point. But for a proof of concept, I decided to just kind of leave it at this. So I have two demos, for the rootkit. The first is using the PMU to hook sysgetdent64, which is a popular choice for process and file hiding. So to set up this demo, basically I'm going to be I'm loading sort of a fake kernel integrity monitor where I'm just periodically scanning the syscall table and other regions in the kernel and computing a hash. And then I just started some malware thread that's running in the kernel. All it's doing is printing out, this is nasty, print K malware. So if we look on our file system, we can see this malware secrets file. And if we do a process listing, we should see our malware worker thread. And this, again, is on the same Nexus 6 that I was working with earlier. Just to show that there's like a legitimate phone. I'm using the Reflector 2 app, which I highly recommend for mirroring and casting devices. But so now we're going to load our PMU rootkit. So now it says PMU assisted rootkit is now cloaking stuff. So if we look on the file system, our malware secrets file is gone. And if we do a process listing, we shouldn't be able to find the malware worker thread. And same on the device, we shouldn't be able to see the malware worker thread. So then I've just unloaded that rootkit. And if you notice, the kernel integrity monitor was still happy. And now we can see the worker thread again, because the PMU assisted rootkit was removed and the file showed back up. So then finally, I'm going to do a traditional rootkit where I'm just going to patch sysgetdents in the syscall table. And to kind of prove that it was a legit patch, we shouldn't see the malware secrets file. But now notice our super duper secure kernel integrity monitor says that things are corrupt. So kind of the intent of that demo was just to kind of show a PMU assisted rootkit in action, where we're actually able to redirect and modify data returning back to user mode, all while using just PMU based traps. But in my opinion, Linux rootkits are boring, and this is a phone. So to make it kind of more interesting, I decided to try to hook read, but in the context of QMuxD, Now QMuxD is a user space daemon in Android, much of the same codes in Com Center, or handled by Com Center in iOS, but it's basically responsible for routing QMI packets to and from the modem and to their respective clients in the high-level OS. And you can kind of think of QMI as like a custom Haze AT command or something, but we're gonna hook sysread the same way we just hook getDense, but only using the PMU. So that's our next demo here. So for this demo, I have 2 phones, and everything was, as I mentioned before, I'm using the Reflector 2 app to mirror the devices, but the iPhone on the left is a clean device, and then we see the count there on the right, and that's going to be the rootkitted device. So I'm going to send the text from the iPhone to the Android, and the iPhone or the Nexus receives it. It says, "Hi, how are you?" So now we're going to install our new rootkit, which is hooking read. And we're going to read the kernel log, and we should start to see QMI packets being printed out. So I just sent a text from the device, and we notice that on the screen, it's on the Nexus, it's displaying hello, but it appended PMU rootkits are fun. So I decided, preventing SMS from showing up is not very attractive demo, so I decided to, basically parse the QMI and append 7-bit ASCII to the end of the incoming SMS, which was a pain, I'll admit, but then now the iPhones send a text says OH, and the rootkit is appended IO, so it's clearly a Buckeye fan, if anybody knows what that even means. And then finally, just to show that we're man the middling that incoming QMI stream, we'll check our balance on T-Mobile, which will send a USSD request, and we should see in the QMI dump the response or the originating USSD message from the network, and it tells us current plan active until whenever. And so yeah, I mean that's pretty much that demo. Basically, just showing that we're able to man in the middle that incoming stream of data in order to potentially have interesting channels of doing malicious things. So yeah, so we sent one more goodbye text, and again the rootkit appended the same PMU rootkits are fun message. So some analysis and limitations. So trapping supervisor call instructions seems to add anywhere from like 2 to 5% overhead, depending on kind of load on the device. And I mentioned it should evade current kernel integrity monitor algorithms. I didn't validate this, but I'd be surprised if these monitors cared that all we've done is registered an interrupt service routine. A couple limitations: the PMU registers themselves are non-persistent, so this rootkit would not be persistent. Every time a core comes out of reset, the PMU registers will all be loaded with their respective reset values. And then any other code running in the kernel or higher could tamper with the registers, so they could stop something from counting, so that could become problematic. So how would we detect this rootkit? You could try just reading proc interrupts. However, the data that's showing there is easy to modify, and potentially we could prevent the PMU's IRQ line from even showing up. You could try to just query the registers and see if somebody's counting supervisor call instructions. It's worth noting that access to the PMU can be trapped to hypervisor mode. So if an attacker had control over the hypervisor exception vector table, that could be interesting. And as we'll see in a minute, not all usage of this is malicious. I guess more generically, just identifying an increase in interrupts is probably your best bet. So there's trace points in the Linux kernel that you can't really avoid. or we couldn't avoid. And I suppose you could try to iterate. Linux has like a radix tree that has all the interrupt handlers in it based on the IRQ number. So I suppose you could try to validate addresses in there that, that the handler is in, maybe the static kernel image or something. But if you're familiar with Shadow Walker, you might be able to do interesting things by trapping data or prefetch aborts, so that anytime somebody tried to read memory where our code lives, we could potentially trap that and then serve up bogus data like Shadow Walker did. So our final case study here is on defense, and just to kind of show you that it's probably more powerful on the defensive side. So same approach, we're going to trap supervisor call instructions, but we're going to do syscall monitoring. So if you're familiar with Microsoft's EMET or anti-ROP tools like it, they all are pretty similar in that on Windows, they all inject DLLs into the processes they want to protect, which is kind of interesting because they're trying to prevent code reuse attacks, but in doing so, they're increasing the surface of code reuse attacks. And so by doing monitoring from the kernel, we can avoid that. And this is much easier to implement than the rootkit because we don't have to worry about redirecting code execution. We just need to apply some sort of integrity policy to make sure things are legit on the syscall. And further, that could allow us to protect COTS binaries so we don't have to lean on vendors to compile in protections. And we don't have to patch the kernel, we just need to register. Just need a kernel module loaded or some other way to register for an interrupt service routine. So I decided to select stage fright, which has been obviously very popular since last Black Hat. This is data provided from the Nexus security bulletins. And as we can see, there's been a ton of remote code execution and privilege escalation bugs, either in lib stage fright or labeled as media server, but I'm just collectively calling them media. So I decided to try to create a little proof of concept, basically just do syscall monitoring and detect some of the same anti-ROP checks that EMET and ROPGuard do. And I used proof of concepts from Mark Brand of Google, who had a great blog on this particular CVE. And then that's the same CVE that Northbit has a metaphor proof of concept. So I use both those kind of in combination. So for our last demo, I'm going to show exploiting the device, and then we'll load our mitigations and try it again. So we're going to start a netcat listener, and we'll browse to a site that plays this particular media file, and we should see we get a connection back. So now we have a shell in the context of media server, and we can do a get prop to show you it's a legit device. This is a Hammerhead device running Android 5.1. It's a Nexus 5. So we'll exit that shell, close out our browser, and now we're going to load our mitigations, which is, again, just going to trap system calls in order to apply those anti-ROP checks. And we'll see what happens. So we load our kernel module. We can see some verbose output I put in here where I'm configuring the counters to count system calls or supervisor instructions. So now we're going to browse the same site, and we should see some ASCII art appear, which is saying exploit blocked. So if we look at the bottom there, we can see that it detected a stack pivot in this binder thread, which is part of media server. It was on an mprotect call, and it notes that the current stack pointer is outside the range that it was expecting, so it terminated that thread. So that's just kind of a fun extension, I guess, of demonstrating what some defensive use cases that you could do on ARM-based cores. With pretty light overhead, under 5%. So potential future work. I got sidetracked from doing this originally, but that first demo I showed you of tracing, I'd like to be able to do that on some basebands. And then, also, if you're able to do something similar on iOS kernel, that would probably be more valuable than Android. So I know I'm running low on time, but this slide's important to me, so I need to recognize some folks at Endgame. So Cody Pierce has been extremely supportive and encouraging me to publish. Eric Meller is a mobile researcher at Endgame that helped me get some devices and provide feedback on some ideas. Jamie Butler helped educate me on some rootkit techniques, and several others at Endgame that wish to remain anonymous. And then I'd like to acknowledge the researchers that have kind of pioneered the PMU-assisted security research, because I think it's a pretty interesting subject. So with that, I don't know if there's time for questions. If not, I'll be around all weekend, so feel free to ask anything.